Hey, this is Khan, you're watching Ninja Pulls, and this is launch day for update 46 and for subclassing. So I've put together 3 basic setups for this new system. It is a huge change, and I'm probably never going to be able to offer a complete suite of DPS builds the way I used to when there were only 14 of them. Now there are thousands of combinations, probably only dozens which are worth playing around with, and only a handful which will actually be competitive in late game. Either way, it's going to take a while for us to catch up and figure out exactly how to approach all of this, but for now, here's the Arcanist loadout, which is going to be the most common, with a few tweaks to make it your own, or to make it work with the type of groups you're in. The short version is that we're going to have Herald of the Tome, Assassination, and for the third line, I'm going to tentatively recommend Adric's Spear if you're running with pugs or fairly casual groups, because that's the simplest option. If your groups are more organized, I'd consider Gravelord for Cleave. Obviously, always check with your raid leads. And finally, Dawn's Wrath, if you want to have more single target and execute power, or just a bit more spice in the rotation. And if you don't mind complicating things just a little bit. I kinda wanted to have a zoo build ready for day 1, but it's been crazy busy, so I guess that'll have to wait a couple of days at least. But there will be more stuff on the way. Let's start with the base class. This is going to be Arcanist, because we want it to be able to use Banner Bearer with the class mastery script giving us free crux. The only way we can do that is if it's an actual Arcanist. Class mastery and class sets from Infinite Archive are 2 of the only things that are still class specific. Also, Herald of the Tome is one of the strongest skill lines for damage, even if we don't use Fate Carver and switch to Tentacular Dread instead of Cephaliarch's Flail. It's still up there as one of the best options. And if we're an Arcanist anyway, we have to use Herald of the Tome because we're not going to keep either of the other skill lines for damage. Slot Fate Carver, Flail, Scholarship, Languid Eye, and Rune. Also take a look at the passives and remind yourself why they're so good. 12% critical damage, 5% weapon and spell damage, free penetration, increased damage and proc chance from status effects, and of course the whole crux system. If for some reason you can't make your character an Arcanist or you don't want to, then you can drop the banner and just slot a couple of extra skills that will passively increase your damage. Camouflaged Hunter, for example. Next up, Assassination. If you've been following the PTS, then yeah, this is starting to look awfully familiar. I'd love to do something different, but hey, the meta is what it is, and it is also narrowing as a direct result of subclassing. We'll see how that changes as time goes on, but for now, you're going to see a lot of these 2 skill lines. Again, the passives are a big part of why. Free crit chance for slotting assassination abilities, plus a whole lot more whenever we're flanking, another 10% critical damage, and a nice sustain boost when adds are dying regularly. We're going to slot Relentless Focus passively on the back bar and Soul Harvest on the front bar. Again, this is mostly for the passive crit chance and ulti-gen. For pure single target fights, we can use the other morph of this and the bow proc, as well as Surprise Attack and Killer's Blade, but Fate Carver is just so good in so many situations that it's worth making that our priority and choosing other things that are gonna buff it. The final skill line is more flexible than you might think. Storm Calling from the Sorcerer is really good. In fact, you can grab most of the major damage skill lines like Animal Companions from the Warden, Ardent Flame from the Dragonknight, and they all get pretty similar damage on the dummy. We're talking 160, 170k DPS, but for pure simplicity, it's hard for me not to recommend Adric's Spear. Especially when a new thing drops like subclassing, most players are going to value a bit of simplicity, at least initially. And like I said, we will be putting up more guides and subclassing combos over the coming days and weeks, but for now, the passives in Adric's Spear give us Burning Light, which amounts to free damage basically, plus another 6% weapon and spell damage, and some free armor. These are not necessarily the best passives available to us, but we don't even have to slot anything to get the benefits. That's why so many players have gravitated towards this combo during PTS. But if you do want to slot Blazing Spear, for example, you'll get another 10% critical damage. In organized trial groups, chances are you won't need that, but hey, it's there. That leaves room for Quick Cloak and Barbed Trap or Camouflaged Hunter. If you're running Heroism on your banner, then you're going to go with Camo Hunter most of the time. But if you have Heroism potions, then you can put Savagery and Prophecy on the banner instead and use Trap for a little extra damage. The back bar can be a little tricky, and this applies to all three of the setups in this video. For maximum damage, you probably want to go with the Maelstrom two-hander to buff the Fate Carver beam and the Radiant Oppression beam, which are both now direct damage, remember? But that makes stamina sustain tougher, to the point where you may need to switch food, or you can just use the Maelstrom Inferno instead. The gear is probably going to be Unsoul plus Deadly a lot of the time. Our weapon and spell damage stat is so high with this setup that the flat amount offered by Coral Riptide has weakened relatively compared to Unsoul, which grants a percentage boost. Riptide is still better if you can sustain it, and there's the problem. Now the banner has changed to be much tougher on sustain, Riptide is pretty much out the window for longer fights with the banner. Null Archer got buffed and is now one of the top options for single target damage, but in crowded fights Unsoul can still win out, especially if your group is building around that extra line of penetration, which many seem to have been doing on PTS. Remember that Runecarver and Azure Blight are both out now that the beam has been changed to direct damage. Deadly is still fine because it boosts channels as well as dots, and the new crafted set, Tideborn Wildstalker, is also pretty interesting. So Unsoul or Null Archer with Deadly or Wildstalker. You can't really go wrong with any of those combinations. On the dummy and stationary fights, you can use Highland Sentinel. Coming back to sustain, you'll probably find you need to run Lavafoot food on the dummy and maybe in some dungeon fights too, but with good supports you should be able to run Bystat food in trials. You can also go Magicka or Stamina now, but I found it easier to sustain this as a Stamina DD. If you start using some of the other skill lines instead of Adric Spear, such as Dawn's Wrath for example, that can flip the other way, and Magicka can become the easier choice. Either way, you're going to want Tri-Restoration potions, so make sure you're getting Prophecy and Savagery from somewhere. The rotation is very familiar. Banner gives us a Crux every 5 seconds, Flail gives us another, then we beam and try to keep up our dots as best we can in between. You can recast Quick Cloak and Scholarship together since they're both 30 seconds, and if you're using Stampede on the back bar, you can pair that up with Rune every 18 seconds or so, which is how long the Merciless Charge buff lasts. Uptimes are not going to be perfect, but with a Fate Carver setup, they never are. I generally use the Languid Eye ultimate as a default, but when your target is in Execute and the Eye isn't going to be available in time, feel free to use Soul Harvest instead. On the dummy, this hits close to 170k. There are a bunch of variants with Herald of the Tome and Assassination hitting between 165 and 180k, but some are more effective on the dummy, while others will be more effective in content. One of the main things to keep in mind is just how much in this setup translates to AoE damage. Burning Light only hits one target at a time, but it's still a lot of cleave in total. In Trash and against bosses with adds or mini-bosses, this should perform really well. But I do want to stress that this Adric Spear setup isn't really optimal. It's a bit like running the typical Unsoul and Deadly setup on an Arcanist last patch. Perfectly decent, and it kind of works everywhere, but it's rarely optimal, more of a jack of all trades, if that makes sense. At least that's how I see it. What about Gravelord? Gravelord doesn't look that special on the dummy, and I think a lot of attention turned away from this skill line when Fate Carver was changed to direct damage. But I want to highlight it for several reasons. First, the active abilities are pretty nice. We can't really fit most of them into our rotation here, as the Arcanist rotation kinda dominates, but Siphon is worth slotting just passively and worth using if you can cast it on enemies that are dying, and the Skeletal Archer also has very strong single target damage. But we're mostly interested in the passives. That Death Knell Execute applies to every target you're hitting, unlike active execute abilities which only affect a specific target. This will just kick in whenever anything drops below 25% health, which is obviously hugely valuable in multi-target fights. Rapid Rot is also great. Even if it no longer affects Fate Carver, it still buffs almost a quarter of our damage, so a 2.5% damage increase in total. Sure, that's not amazing, But again, this may become more significant in crowded fights. We're not going to get a ton out of reusable parts since we want to focus on beaming with this setup, and Dismember is useless on the dummy since we're already way over the penetration cap, but that's because the dummy has the Alkosh debuff applied. If all the DDs in our group bring Gravelord and Herald of the Tome, that's 4.5k penetration. Enough to drop Alkosh and put one of the DDs back on a full damage setup. Also, Alkosh uptimes are never perfect, but the uptime on these passives should be. And again, this will be particularly valuable in multi-target fights, where it can be difficult to debuff everything equally. Obviously, it will vary from group to group, but you can just do a back-of-the-envelope calculation and see that the gains could be significant. I'm just saying, Gravelord is worth thinking about, especially if cleave damage is what you're after. And let's face it, that's what Fate Carver is for a lot of the time. Ultimately, these are the sorts of decisions that groups and raid leads are going to have to make. The gear and consumables are the same, and once again I'd suggest running this setup as a Stamina Arcanist. That worked better for me. Rotation, also the same. Replace Rune with Archer, and again, you can recast this together with Stampede if you want. Saves you having to deal with that awkward animation. And finally, what about Dawn's Wrath? This is the setup that's probably been getting the most attention, and the single target pressure is very good. It pulls ahead of both Adric Spear and Gravelord in my testing, but actually not by that much. We're talking 2 to 3%? In situations where cleave is most important, that doesn't feel like it's worth it. But if it's a single target fight or the adds aren't that important, or if the boss has a particularly nasty execute phase, or if you just want to do something other than Fate Carver the entire fight, this is a great choice. Slot Solar Barrage and Radiant Oppression and you're all set. Like I said, the meta is looking pretty narrow at the moment. Of course, you can do other combos, but Herald of the Tome and Assassination are just such a strong baseline that they're pretty hard to pass up. Again, the rotation is identical until about 33%, at which point you can drop Fate Carver and Flail and focus on the Templar beam instead. Try to keep up Flail every 20 seconds for the debuff, and refresh your dots so they run right to the end if you can, but below 15%, I think you can pretty much drop everything and just beam your way to victory. Because the beam costs Magicka, this does work better on a Magicka spec, but you can always use the other morph if you don't want to change your primary resource. That's it. Like I said, you can really do whatever you want. If you want to add some pets into the mix, drop the banner, or run a more complex rotation, go for it. And remember, if you do get rid of the banner, then suddenly this doesn't need to be an Arcanist anymore. You can make it any class you want. I'm just offering some day one advice. We will know a lot more in the weeks and months ahead. That's going to be it for this one. I hope the various trade-offs here made some sense, and I'll do my best to offer some more in-depth rotation advice in the coming days. In the meantime, enjoy yourselves. Remember to support Ninja Pulls if this is one of the channels that you enjoy watching. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next one.